Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too.
To your Sioux Falls City Council informational meeting. Today's Tuesday, May 14th. We'll call this meeting to order. Our first item of business is Councilor Pat Starr, Siouxland Heritage Museum Board update.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had pulled that information out.
We'll come back to it.
Yeah, oh, actually, if you would, give me just a second.
Councilor Neitzer, are you ready for UDC?
Yes,
All right,
yes, I am.
go ahead. We'll come back to Councilor Starr.
Okay, UDC meeting last week. Councilor Starr now serves as our chair, and he chaired the first meeting for us, did a great job. We had TIP revisions, which is the Transportation Improvement Plan, which was to move a couple of projects out a year, had to do with right-of-way acquisition delays and some other things. Added money into the plan for a couple of bridge improvements, which we're going to have some federal funding, as I recall, to rehab a couple of bridges inside of the city of Sioux Falls. Our state funds are being used for that. And then we also added more money to I-229 and Cliff and Minnesota exits, studies for those. So those are going to be rebuilt in the coming years. There was a report on the 85th and I-29 interchange open house that was extremely well attended. That's going to be a diverging diamond. Right-of-way acquisition continues, and that's a major contingency that's going to play into the timing of the work. There's significant private contribution from private developers and landowners. There's also money from all the other levels of government. We also discussed 69th Street. Someday that will be an overpass, but not an interchange. And then we did talk about the Maple Park Street corridor, which is essentially, that's Maple Street going from Veterans Parkway eastbound to Highway 11, which is in Brandon, the Split Rock Boulevard. To improve that from a gravel road to a paved road with higher speeds, it's projected to carry thousands of cars as the years go by, as Sioux Falls grows into it and Brandon grows out. And the major challenge there is the county has to figure out how to pay for it. That's going to be a huge cost for the county, and they'll be looking for grants, and the city will probably fund part of it in our growth area. That was an open house that was very well attended, and those were the highlights. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Starr.
I am ready now.
That's
Thank
okay.
you, Madam Chair. A couple of things that are going on at the Siouxland Heritage Museum that are kind of exciting. May is one of the busiest months with school groups. So there are lots of young people that are touring both of the museums, the old courthouse as well as the Pettigrew. But what I find interesting is the number of presentations that the museum does at the school site as well as the people who come on site. So it's an exciting time of the year for the museum, and again, really busy. The summer concert series begins on June 7th, which happens to be my birthday, if anyone wants to bring a birthday cake along for the kick off the concert season. And that concert series goes through August 30th. One of the other items that was really exciting is that the new custom Delta design cabinets for the ethnographic collection have arrived, and they are installing those at the Resource Center, at the Irene Hall Resource Center. It was a donation that was made by the Siouxland Heritage Museum Alliance. And it was a $36,000 donation that the Alliance was able to do. So they have a pork raffle, they do the cemetery tours, the quarry tour, and a lot of activities. The Alliance does an awesome job supporting the museum, and this was just one of the many ways that we get to see their hard work put into play. One of the other items that are coming on, and it's really timely today with the Convention and Visitors Bureau having their event, the Mountain Plains Museum Association is going to have their national conference in Sioux Falls in 2020. And the conference is September 2nd through the 5th, and they expect 300 to 500 museum people from around the country to be here and see some of our exhibits and get a chance to show off South Dakota as part of this. So it's the Mountain Plains Association, so the central states all the way from North Dakota to Texas. I believe New Mexico, and like I said, their usual attendance is somewhere between 300 and 500 people, which will make a lot of room nights, but also people who work in our state really hard in the museum industry to get a chance to show off Sioux Falls and South Dakota. So those are the most exciting things that were going on at the board meeting this week.
Thank you for the update. Any questions for Councilor Neitzert or Starr? Okay, seeing none, we'll move to open discussion. Any open discussion? Councilor Brecky.
Something out, and then I'm going to read it to you. Oopsies. Thank you, council members. You have before you a letter that I wrote to the Argus Leader that they refused to publish, and I felt compelled to speak to you through this letter, and the only way I could think of to do it was to use this forum to do that. I do think it's a conciliatory letter, and I think it's important for me that my viewpoint be shared on the issue that we were facing last week. So it's a letter to the editor from Councilmember Janet Brecky. I am writing in response to the recent letter to the editor by former Councilmember Rex Rolfing and the May 5th Argus Leader editorial. In my opinion, both articles missed the point. In today's environment of good versus evil, winners versus losers, or us versus them frameworks, it is plain to see that the Sioux Falls City Council is suffering from the same ultra-polarization that is immobilizing our federal government. The problem that arose with the City Council's hiring of an internal audit manager has very little to do with the candidate that was ultimately selected. Ultimately, the failed discussions and subsequent actions are symptoms of a larger problem. The larger problem is the City Council's inability to discuss any divisive problem in a deliberative, open-minded manner. Since I joined the City Council last year, I have tried to promote and adhere to good government procedures and practice, decorum, ethics, Robert's Rules of Order, open meetings, and open records laws. So why does process matter? I believe good process matters because solving complex problems calls for creativity and collaboration in ways that us versus them, winners versus losers, and good versus evil does not. In a political context, the idea that the good need to simply destroy the evil as we were taught in the movies of our childhood simply does not apply. Affixing blame and demonizing individual council members is counterproductive. We all have a role to play in our dysfunction. Ron Brownstein, CNN senior political analyst, spoke at the National League of Cities about congressional polarization on the healthcare issue. He said, both sides claimed they could not talk about the issue because they were too far apart. Brownstein's suggestion, being far apart on an issue, is not a reason to refuse to discuss an issue. Rather, being far apart on an issue is the very reason you begin discussions. The City Council needs to engage in a deliberative process where we interact and listen to each other. I believe each of us has a valuable perspective to bring to the discussion. We need to work on our ability to collaborate and to compromise. If we cannot take the time and effort to work to achieve consensus on hiring an internal audit manager, how can we expect to solve the complex problems facing the city? This us versus them mentality serves no one well, least of all the residents of Sioux Falls. As a final word, I would simply say that I am committed to engaging in a process where we can collaborate and deliberate. And I would try to show as much leadership as I could to do that, because I think that is something that we need to work on as a group together. And I, for one, will try very hard to work collaboratively with my fellow council members and to do a better job of listening. I realize that, I have a role to play in the dysfunction, and my role is perhaps that I don't listen well enough because I start to take a position and then advocate for that position. So I will certainly try to do my part to bring us together, and if this resonates with any of you, I hope you will help me do your parts as well. Thank you.
Any other open discussion? Okay, seeing none, we'll move to the first item, Sioux Empire Leadership Council Resolution. Welcome, TJ, Deputy Chief of Staff.
Good afternoon. Last week in the State of the City, you heard the mayor talk about breaking down silos and working collaboratively throughout our community across jurisdictions, across boundaries, and working with the private sector. For the last couple of years, as you may know, the city has been involved with discussions with the county and the court system, Lincoln County, Minnehaha County, about a coordinating council to work across our jurisdictional boundaries on some major issues in our city. The Sioux Falls Leadership Council has morphed from that coordinating council conversation, and next Tuesday we'll be having a vote on the resolution to essentially guarantee the city's seat at the table for the Leadership Council. It essentially brings together the list of entities you see on the screen, and it will give governance to the project charters that this group will work on collaboratively. The two big ones that we've talked about would be the triage center, as well as the pretrial screening, which was made possible by the MacArthur grant last year. So what the resolution doesn't do is it doesn't handcuff the city to any certain policy. It doesn't appropriate any money. It does not make us adopt something that may be in conflict with what we want to do as a council and as a city. What it does do is just give us a seat at the table for these discussions and allow us to participate in some really important things like the triage center. We'll get into two specifics on those specific charters, and we'll turn it over for you for any questions on the resolution.
Thank you, TJ. Any questions for TJ? Go ahead, Councilor Starr.
Mr. Nelson, I guess my question is, we talk about the groups that are going to be part of the council, but did we specifically say how we as a city are going to select our representatives to be part of this group, or how? What do you envision? A couple of counselors, a couple of what do you think of the makeup and how they're appointed?
Yeah, great question. The council itself is those entities, and the bylaws has the mayor as a member, and then the city council amongst itself will select a representative for that body. So it'll be one council member and the mayor. And in Minnehaha County Commission will have one, Lincoln County Commission will have one, school board will have one as well.
So do we have a copy of the bylaws then?
I can circulate that. Yeah, I can do that before next week.
That would make sense.
And though, and if I may, the bylaws are draft. The resolution adopts the body, and then that body will adopt the bylaws. So it's a draft form for that body to consider.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you for being here. Appreciate that. I have been attending these this group for a little while on and off, and so it's like TJ said, it's just the bylaws will be adopted by the resolution, but this is our good faith effort as Minnehaha County and Lincoln County both adopt it as well for us to keep moving the process forward for triage, and also adjust. It's my understanding that it can tackle other items that impact the city, and there's great evidence that other cities have done the same thing. So, perfect, thank you. And that's coming forward next week, is that right, TJ? I'm sorry.
Yes, it is on. It'll be on next Tuesday's agenda.
The first reading. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. The next item up, welcome Director Sean Pritchett, amended management agreement of Washington Pavilion Management, Inc. for Orpheum Theater.
Good afternoon. Sean Pritchett with Finance. Coming here today to talk about the Orpheum Theater. I still recall my first time that I actually got to see the Orpheum Theater. It was probably about 8 years ago. Attended a recital for my daughter, who was fairly young at the time, probably 7 or 8 years old, and got an opportunity to experience what the Orpheum Theater was like. And I had lived in the town for probably about 8 years, but didn't even realize this facility existed. And one of the things that struck me about this facility is what a great asset it is to the community, and what a historical building it is as well for our community. And the next time I actually had an opportunity to see the Orpheum Theater was 8 years later. It was shortly after I became Director of Finance. And again, was kind of struck by that same feeling of the importance of this property and this asset to our community. As a finance department, we're charged with serving as a contract administrator for the various event venues here that are owned by the city. And as part of that, and part of our objectives, especially recently, is looking at how we maximize our investment in these facilities. Maximize the investment that's being made by the taxpayers of the city of Sioux Falls, and making sure that these community assets have the maximum utilization that we can have from them. As part of that, that kind of folded into our discussions here. I don't know where the remote went. Oh. In terms of our management of the facility. And so next week, we're going to be bringing to you a request to amend the management agreement for the Washington Pavilion Management, Inc. WPMI has managed the Washington Pavilion since its inception many years ago, and has been a good partner with the city in regard to that particular facility. Most recently, and for many years, SMG, in partnership with Spectra, has served as our management entity for the Orpheum Theater. I believe it was actually the first item that the SMG actually managed for the city of Sioux Falls. So SMG handles this general maintenance and the general management bookings for the facility. Spectra has been our food and beverage operator. And the proposal that would come to you would request transitioning of that management effective on July 1st of 2019 to the Washington Pavilion. That would require amending the existing Washington Pavilion Management, Inc. Management agreement, and it would also require termination just specifically for the Orpheum Theater of the management agreements with both Spectra and SMG for this particular facility, as well as assignment of those obligations to Washington Pavilion and assumption by Washington Pavilion of those. I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that here in a few minutes. Just a little history on the actual Orpheum Theater. So it was constructed about 106 years ago. And since that time, it's been used for a variety of purposes. It's been used for vaudeville, repertory theater, movies, and other entertainment. Currently, the facility is primarily used for plays, concerts, dances, recitals, banquets, weddings, and other related community events. The historic proscenium theater, which you'd see off to the right there, there's kind of a schematic diagram here in the presentation, seats about 686 patrons. The Annie Zabel Theater, which is a flexible flat space theater, seats up to 450 individuals. And then there is some classroom space located adjacent to that. There's an outdoor courtyard as well as next to the newer lobby for the facility. Upstairs, we also house CityLink, which is the city's studios for various television programming, and there are various offices upstairs as well. Primary users for the current facility is the Sioux Empire Community Theater, or SECT. The Sioux Falls Jazz and Blues Society is also a tenant for the facility, as well as it's the indoor home of the Sioux Falls Municipal Band before they begin as a practice before they begin their outdoor season. But this is also host to a variety of different events, whether they be local performing arts musicians, as well as national acts that have been booked here over time. Attendance has been about approximately 30,000 people annually, and that average is about 110 to 144 event days per year. The city has invested significantly in this facility over time. The most significant investment was a renovation that was done in 2007 for approximately $1.8 million. But as you can see from this list here on the presentation, we continued to make significant investments into this facility over time, making sure that it continues to be an asset for our community. The next major investment that will be made and is planned is the boiler replacement for the facility. As we look at this proposal, the primary objective that we're looking to serve as a result of this, as we look at this theater, is to preserve the Orpheum Theater as a community asset for downtown, maximizing its utilization and access to the arts for Sioux Falls residents in the most cost-effective manner for the city as a whole. As I noted before, SMG has managed this facility for quite some time, and this was the first facility, I believe, and Jim and Mike are here from SMG, but this was the first facility that SMG had managed for us. Growing out of that partnership and that positive experience that we had with SMG and the confidence that we had built up working with them, they continued to broaden the scope of what they were doing for the city over time. that eventually grew to and continue to include the Convention Center, the Sioux Falls Arena, the Denny Sanford Premier Center, as well as most recently in the last year and a half, the baseball park. So as you can see, we very much diversified the things that we had them working on with and for the city. But that area of focus has been primarily related to the Event Center campus. So now the Orpheum has kind of become that one asset that is several miles away from there that hasn't been a part of that. And so as part of this overall strategy, it really is about focusing the quality and positive work that we've had with SMG and with Spectra with relation to the Event Center campus. The Washington Pavilion, which has been managed for WPMI, who has managed the Washington Pavilion, is a nonprofit entity, is located just a few short blocks down the street from the Orpheum Theater. And it has many of the same missions and goals that are reflected of what we would like to see incorporated with the theater. It is a nonprofit entity. It is dedicated to the arts and really built into that community of the arts. And so there's a natural affinity and certainly synergies that exist as a result of that. The fact that they are down the street helps immensely as well. But it is an overarching goal. Is one of the things that's been fun to see over time in relation is the building of a downtown arts district, essentially. And that really started with the Washington Pavilion when that was developed several decades ago. And that has grown over time. We've had the Orpheum Theater, but that has grown to include most recently the Levitt, but the Sculpture Walk, you have the Museum of Visual Materials, the possibility of a state theater down the line really has built that whole district feel for downtown. That has led over time to many discussions in regarding to the Washington Pavilion and whether it made sense based on those similarities that exist on having the Washington Pavilion actually manage the Orpheum Theater. But as we had discussions over time with the Washington Pavilion, the timing wasn't right for that particular organization. And to the credit of the Washington Pavilion, as a nonprofit entity, recognizing and being self-aware of the fact that they wanted to make sure they were in the best position to accept that responsibility. They wanted to make sure that they were on solid ground, that they had the foundation established so that when the opportunity arose for them to be managing the Orpheum Theater, that they would be successful in that endeavor. The other primary thing that I would point out as well is the synergies or the similarities between the structures, because we're not just engaging a management company to operate or to book our facility or to promote it, but we're asking them to be caretakers for our facility as well on behalf of the city. And when you have an aged building that is 100+ years old, it has unique characteristics. And I can think of nobody better than the Washington Pavilion, who has a history of managing a 300,000+ square foot building that is over 100 years old. They understand how to deal with older buildings, how to maintain them. I had an opportunity about a week ago to go tour some of the inner workings of the Washington Pavilion, to see the boiler room and some of that, and to see the pride and the passion that their staff take in maintaining that facility. We've also had a long history of working with the Washington Pavilion in terms of capital improvements. We know how they operate, and we have confidence in what they've been doing in regard to maintaining that particular facility. So it makes for a natural transition in regard to the Orpheum Theater. Over time, the Orpheum Theater has had negative operations in terms of what our investment has been. So over the last 3 years approximately, the city, based on their financials, the net investment from the city has been about $500,000 per year. Now, you have to be somewhat careful in analyzing these numbers because incorporated in this are shared expenses relative to SMG, some of their overhead expenses and so on and so forth, that don't necessarily go away when we would exit if we were to transition from SMG management over to Washington Pavilion. Some of those overhead fixed expenses would slide back over to the Event Center and be shared among the facilities that they continue to remain. However, we hope that as part of this, over time, that we will reduce and become more efficient with the amount of funds that we are expending as part of our investment into the Orpheum Theater. As far as the management agreement amendment, which you will see a copy of the proposed agreement, which we worked on with our city attorney's office, as well as we had engaged with an external counsel to assist with these efforts as well. There will be no change in the term. So we're a year and a half approximately into our agreement with Washington management, with Washington Pavilion's management. And so we did not extend the term of that agreement. So it would still cease on December 31st, 2022, but there is also a 5-year extension option as part of that agreement. So we see this as a long-term relationship as it is pertains in regard to the Orpheum Theater. But what it does incorporate is incorporates the Orpheum Theater as part of that agreement and amends it into the original agreement. So the Orpheum Theater would in essence be subject to most all of the same requirements that we require for the Washington Pavilion as well, and it actually worked very smoothly to integrate those two into the same agreement. When you, as part of that agreement, you will see Exhibit A's, and those Exhibit A's will include 2 attachments. There'll be what's called termination, assignment, and assumption agreements. There'll be one for SMG, and there will be one for Spectra. And what that essentially does is it terminates the management relationship with those entities related specifically and only to the Orpheum Theater. It will also include the assignment of obligations related to the bookings and so forth for the theater and the assets related to it. And the Washington Pavilion countersigns it, assuming those. So the 3 entities actually each sign, the city, SMG, or Spectra, and the Washington Pavilion Management, Inc. all sign those particular addendums. The main agreement, though, will be the Washington Pavilion amended agreement. So there'll be one resolution that would come to you next week for your consideration and approval, which will incorporate all into one. A couple other changes related to the agreement that you will see. It will require separate budgets to be submitted for the Washington Pavilion and for the Orpheum, so you will see that as part of our appropriations process each year. It will also require that the audit separate each of those facilities, so we're able to track those separately as well. That's a requirement we always had with SMG, and that will not change under this circumstance. The only other 2 changes that will occur to the agreement that are unrelated to the Orpheum transition, but because we are amending the agreement, we decided to address these 2. One is to move the audit date requirement submission for the Washington Pavilion from July 31st to November 30th. That reflects a change in Washington Pavilion's fiscal year. They moved this year from a December 31st to a June 30th fiscal year. So obviously they cannot get an audit done in 30 days, so it extends that time period in a way that makes sense for their submission of their audit. It also eliminates the old Article 16. This is old language that's no longer required. It related to the bonding of the Washington Pavilion and some compliance requirements that WPMI had to meet. Because those bonds are paid off, that area is no longer applicable, and so we're just removing that section. Talking very quickly about the remote's not working. I want to talk a little bit about the management structure comparison between the 2. So it's good to understand there are variations between how our management structures are between SMG, Spectra, and the Washington Pavilion Management, Inc. First of all, SMG and Spectra are both for-profit entities, so the way that we compensate them as part of their management agreements with the city is they either receive a management fee, which is the case with SMG, or they share in a portion of the overall sales and profitability, which is the case with Spectra on the food and beverage side. So the city and Spectra share in that profitability as part of that management arrangement, and those remain unchanged as they were stipulated in the original agreements with those 2 entities. Very similar between the Washington Pavilion and SMG. Both are responsible for promoting, operating, and managing the facilities, but what's a little bit different from SMG or Spectra's position is that SMG operates pretty much out of one operating account. All revenues and expenses are paid in and out of that account. That account is owned by the city, but SMG controls it in terms of being able to collect the revenues and pay the expenses. So we do not show the revenues and expenses necessarily on our financials as a city as it relates to SMG's facilities that they're managing, but we do show the net equity position. So as the event center has been profitable over the last several years, the revenues have exceeded expenses, their net equity position has increased. That net equity position is reported as part of the entertainment tax fund. And I make that definition because whether the city appropriates money to assist in the operations of a facility like we do for the Washington Pavilion, or it's run through the fund or the account that SMG manages, both essentially are awash within the entertainment tax fund. As far as the Washington Pavilion Management, Inc., that is a nonprofit entity. We do not pay them a management fee as it relates to the Washington Pavilion. What we do is we help and assist with operations by making an appropriation each year. And the same would hold true then for the Orpheum. Now, we already appropriate for the Orpheum, and even though it hasn't necessarily drawn money from the city because it has been covered by the profits of the event center, that appropriation is already in place. It has been for years. We've always erred on the side of caution because we can't rely on the event center necessarily. We are still obligated to make those expenditures should they occur. It's just that the event center has been profitable over the last several years and has been able to absorb the losses at the Orpheum Theater. But the appropriation has been made every year, and so as part of this arrangement for requesting the change to the management agreement, we're not requesting an additional appropriation. As far as a timeline, SMG and Spectra have both already accepted and signed off on the termination and assignment agreements. The Washington Pavilion's Board of Directors has already approved the amendment and have executed the document. And so the next steps is obviously this informational, and then there'll be a presentation of the resolution to accept the agreement at next week's meeting, council meeting. Should that be approved, then the city would execute the agreements as well, and they would be effective for July 1st, and we would continue those transition discussions. Both SMG, Spectra, and the Washington Pavilion have continued to meet to coordinate what that transition looks like. It's been a very smooth process from all perspectives, and trying to make sure that from the end user perspective, for those that are looking to book the Orpheum Theater, that it doesn't affect them in any way. With that, I don't know, Darren Smith is here, who is the Executive Director for Washington Pavilion Management, Inc. I don't know if he wants to say a few words, and then I can answer any questions you have in relation to this proposal.
Thank you, Director. Welcome back, Darren.
Good afternoon. Good to be back. Darren Smith, Washington Pavilion Management, Inc. I will be brief. I think it's important to touch on a couple of things if I can. We are very excited about this opportunity. We see a lot of synergies between the two facilities in terms of how our staff in particular can maximize the possibilities of each. I think it's also important to note this really is a great time for this transition for us in particular. I hope the city and others feel that way as well. We are at an all-time high for performing arts season subscribers. We're over 3,000 annual subscribers now. That number's never been higher. We're at an all-time high for attendance in our museums. Last year was the second highest level of attendance in the history of the pavilion, second only to the very first year it opened in 1999. And this year we will go over 100,000 attendees in the Kirby Science Discovery Center and Visual Arts Center for the first time ever. So we're very excited about that. Our food and beverage operations have never been better. Our education program is completely full as we're going into the summer months here. I looked just before we left. I think our summer camps, classes, and workshops, we have over 100 of those. We're 99.5% full with a couple weeks of school to go yet, so we'll probably be adding a few more programs this summer. Our youth theater program is just exploding. The last two shows we've had auditions for, we've had close to 250 kids show up to audition, so that's very strong. And finally, our financial position and our growth over these past 2+ years in particular is truly far superior to any time in our 20-year history. So we're very strong there as well. The city direction, I believe, is very clear. The city wants to see improved financials and increased activity levels at the Orpheum. We believe we can deliver on that. In business, and we talk to our staff all the time about this, make no mistake about it, whether you're for-profit, nonprofit, or something else, you are in business. We are in business. And in business, you find success by becoming lean, finding efficiencies, doing more with less. And this is exactly what we've been doing at the Washington Pavilion in recent years, and we'll plan to do the same at the Orpheum. Our financials have improved, and also our programming numbers have improved. I think that's really important. Anybody can come into an organization who understands budgets and cut programs, slash spending, and make that bottom line look really good for a year, maybe two. That's not what's going on with us. What you want to look for in any organization is the revenue growing? Are the programming numbers growing? And again, as I illustrated earlier, our programming numbers across the board have never been this high, or certainly not higher. At the same time, our financial position is much, much better as well. So that's the right type of growth. That's what you want to see in any organization. We will manage the Orpheum with what we believe is a very talented, ambitious staff. We plan to immediately add one full-time staff member who will primarily be assigned to the Orpheum facility for cleaning and maintenance. We're also adding a box office manager next year, largely for our own purposes. We're at the point where we probably need to do that for ourselves. But of course, to be able to have that additional management position now to support the Orpheum as well will be perfect timing. We will begin immediately to support the Orpheum Advisory Board that is in place per city ordinance, just as we do the existing 5+ advisory boards and committees we already have. We have a number of advisory boards and committees we support currently in our current structure, and so that would be an easy transition. We'll also work very closely with them as well as city officials to determine what truly is the most appropriate long-term role for that advisory board. Speaking of boards and representation, our existing 21-member Board of Trustees already has 3 mayoral appointed positions, of course, with City Council advice and consent. So the city's interest in general, where it relates to Washington Pavilion Management Inc., Washington Pavilion, or the Orpheum, either way, the city's interests are represented through those appointments, and of course that will continue to be. The city's interests in general will continue to be represented with those positions. And they are 3-year terms. You can serve up to two consecutive terms. This is in our organizational charter documents as well as in our bylaws. So it's not a recent thing. It's been in place since '99. It'll continue to be that way for a long time to come. Just before we get to questions, I do want to note, I think I agree with virtually everything Sean said, and I just want to make a note that in this particular case, if this change is approved, we will be replacing SMG to manage the Orpheum. SMG is a great partner of ours. We have a great working relationship. I've worked with SMG for a number of years, my previous role with the city. In fact, I was on the committee back in 2011, 2012 that selected SMG Inspectorate to manage the new event center and a number of other facilities. I had a great working relationship with them. That continues. Quite frankly, they help us more than we help them. And they're always happy to do that. They never say no. And I think that's really important to note. That working relationship will continue. As Sean said, I think it's just a really good fit for the pavilion with the Orpheum Theater. A number of people have felt that way for some time. The timing just never worked out primarily for the pavilion to be able to do this. So again, very excited about this opportunity. We do have several team members here who will be most involved in managing the Orpheum. So if you have specific questions, we'd be happy to attempt to answer those today. Jane Hathaway, who's our CFO, handles all the financials and will for the Orpheum is here. Bob Wenlin, who works in our performances and events department, who will handle all the programming at the Orpheum, is here. And then Scott Stratman, our Director of Facilities, who will also be responsible for the Orpheum facility, is here as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. Council, any questions? Councilor Neitzer.
First of all, most of this will be for Director Pritchett. Looking at the Orpheum Theater's financial performance, so I'm looking at the revenues, and it's bobbed a little bit, but it's essentially stayed flat for 5 years. But then I look at the expenditures, and it increased pretty substantially over the years. Looks like about 50% in 5 years, from 440 up to 632. So what's the driver there? Why such a disparity?
I'd have to look at that a little bit closer and get back to you to give you a really good educated reason for that. Part of that it may be in terms of some of the management fees that were paid and they changed, but I don't think that's probably a primary driver of that. So I will have to look into that a little bit further and get back to you on that piece.
Okay. I believe we have an Orpheum board. Does that continue to exist, or does that dissolve?
At this point, there had been no recommendation, so it was to be continued to exist and would be working in conjunction with the Washington Pavilion.
CityLink Studios stay unchanged?
Yes.
And then the last one I had for you, I think, was, it looks like maybe all I have for you. I did have one for Darren or somebody else. What do you envision being the types of things that you might book at this facility?
Yeah, well, what I'd like to, I'm going to give you a brief generic answer, and then Bob is really the expert in this area, so I want him to, because definitely anticipated that question. We've already been talking for some time about making sure we're looking for shows that would be on our radar, that would be a good fit at the Orpheum. I think it's important to understand, again, as Sean mentioned, the theater size at the Orpheum in particular is really a perfect fit for us. We have a theater that's just under, or a hall that's just under 1,900 seats. We have another one that's much smaller at 300. The Orpheum is just under 700. So we would see a wide variety of local performances, some local talent. We pop in some national touring stuff at times. Again, that's appropriate for the Orpheum and a good fit. There's a lot of that out there, quite honestly. It'd be local, some of the dance, ballerina. Bob, why don't you come up here? Am I doing okay?
Yeah. I think Darren laid the groundwork pretty well. To give you some history, we have spent the last 20 years at the Pavilion saying no to a lot of people because we haven't had a venue for their performance. Local people, regional people, national, international performances. Because our small theater of just under 300 seats is far too small for them, and our massive theater, nearly 1,900 seats, is far too big. And so we're sort of looking at this as an opportunity to bring in a lot of, further diversify our entertainment in the city, downtown, and really just Sioux Falls as a whole. I think the other thing to point to is that because we are a nonprofit, we understand a little bit more about some of these sort of mid-range entertainment offerings, where they don't have multi-million tours like Broadway does that they're bringing through town, and so they are a little more free with their money with us. And on the flip side, our Belbus Theater, our small theater, is sort of the opposite of that, and so we're really looking at this as sort of our mid-range opportunity to expand upon the entertainment that we're already bringing to Sioux Falls, and the entertainment that isn't flourishing in the way that we think that it could. So
That's really great to hear. It's going to fill another niche. You've got all of these different levels of attendance and things like that. So you're not going to have two competing against each other. So that's, my last question is, and I think it is for Director Pritchett actually, the operating funding for the pavilion, will that be increased in next year's budget to, let's just, so like if I was just to take, the current operating loss, at the Orpheum, will we see a larger
It should have a
funding increase for the
negligible effect on the existing appropriation as it relates to the Washington Pavilion, that we would still look at that independently, and so that shouldn't materially change as a result to the Orpheum. We'll look at them as two distinct items in terms of the appropriation for next year. That being said, we already appropriate for the Orpheum already as well, and so based on some initial numbers that we've been discussing, there wouldn't be a material modification to that either.
There'll still be a line item for Orpheum.
Correct.
It just happens to be managed by them.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Counselor Starr.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Director Pritchett, help me a little bit. What do we have in the, you said the next capital, because we're looking at operating expenditures. What do we have for the capital expenditures in the budget for the next 5 years? Obviously the boiler, but what kind of dollars are we projecting for the next 5 years into the?
If I'm recalling correctly, I don't believe we had a lot factored in for the Orpheum for the next several years. And Jim's kind of shaking his head on that as well. I think the boiler was the main item that had been plugged in for the Orpheum, but there hadn't been a lot of additional items that had been added at that point.
Okay. Help me with the policy or the overall philosophy of what we're trying to do at the Orpheum. The mayor has stated that one of his goals is to get our managed facilities to get to a operating budget of, closer to zero than 650,000. How does this affect that over the long term? Will we see considerable savings, or are we anywhere in the near future of getting closer to zero than 650?
We are making progress, and that is when we look at all of them collectively. So we look at all of the facilities that are at the Event Center campus, and we look at the Orpheum, and we look at the Washington Pavilion. When we net all of our investments into those on an operating side, net of how they're performing. We've already made some progress over time. And we hope that we continue that trajectory and hope that this transition will help us build momentum toward that. Because in a large part of that was due to the fact that Washington Pavilion has had some very good years in the last couple of years where they've been able to take some of their additional funds and put it into a reserve to shore itself up against future downturns in the economy or things that might occur in relation to the Washington Pavilion. So there's being progress made there. But we're hoping that because of either staffing, synergies and cost savings in terms of, and being very careful about where the expenditures are going, that we do reduce overall, related to the Orpheum Theater, the amount that we've had to essentially invest into it on an operating side over time.
I guess if I can
Go ahead.
continue a little bit. My concern is that we're making a pretty good sized policy change here. You started your presentation with, you know, your daughter and youth dance and some of the things that we've done at the Orpheum, what contributes, or the way it's been explained to me in the past, the reason we have an operating deficit like this is because that we've allowed the Orpheum to do those type of events. And if we're really making a shift towards being profitable, and do we do a show versus a wedding that includes catering that rents out better than the local dance company? You know, that's why we have the third penny tax for arts and entertainment and to take care of these facilities. So I guess it's not that I'm not a supporter, but I'm trying to understand the change in policy.
So I see this in two ways. One is there is a balance with these type of facilities. So I think what the Washington Pavilion has done a very good job of lately is understanding that balance of providing entertainment that really generates more activity for a facility and maybe generates more revenue through that additional activity, while also recognizing that it has a mission in the arts. And so you still continue to bring in those things that may not add to your bottom line, but diversify the amount of arts in our community. But you have to balance that with the business perspective, because without having financial stability, you have a hard time addressing your mission overall. So there is that piece. So it is a balance. And when I say, I started my presentation, I talk about maximizing the investment. And there's many ways that you can look at that. That can be through additional efficiencies by reducing your investment into it from a monetary perspective, but it can also be in terms of how much that facility gets utilized over time and what a kind of an asset. And the example I would give you is if I were to look at this in terms of how we measure success, I would look at how many more people in this community have that first-time experience like I had and had an opportunity to be engaged and to benefit from the Orpheum Theater. And secondarily to that, I would also think about, okay, it was 8 years before I came back to the Orpheum Theater. How do we shrink that down to 8 months? How do we get people to continually be using that facility like they're using other facilities in the community? So when I say maximizing investment, there's two pieces of that I think we look at. So
Totally makes sense, and that's where I think, you know, we all are in business, and I appreciate Mr. Smith being brief today like he always is for us, and I appreciate the work that Bob has done. Been able to keep my child in line with the dapper performance in Lion King and the number of kids that are part of the facility and the things that I totally agree with, the amount of time and people and getting the community involved in the economic development that goes with a theater district and continuing to build on that. So just balancing where those funds are used, and we do tax the community to provide those benefits so that we've done that. But we've seen a lot of good things out of the Washington Pavilion, you know, whether it's the free First Fridays and all of the other balancing that we're able to do. So just want to make sure that we continue down that same road.
okay.
Thank you.
Counselor Silberg.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Bless you. I think Councilor Neitzer his question hit a couple of mine. I was kind of curious in some of the different events that might be coming with these changes, and you talked about that. So overall, and summing this up, is it optimistic? Are we optimistic we're going to make a pretty big cut into the deficits we're used to seeing here? And I know it's not all just getting it to zero. It's part of the experience and offering a service. But I mean, are we really, I guess, optimistic that these big numbers in the red are going to get a little closer to even with this change?
I'm optimistic that we will make progress on this, but I would also be cautionary that it will take time. Because Darren and I have talked about, and they've looked at various shows, but even when you bring a national touring act in, I mean, the margins can be very slim for something of this nature, so, for a theater of this size. So again, kind of getting back to what Councilor Starr was saying, we recognize that it's not all about reducing the expense side, but certainly that is driving some of our conversations in regard to this, and we'd like to see that continue to get reduced over time. And I think that's going to come a lot more potentially somewhat on what elevating the revenues clearly by bringing in some additional entertainment if that's an option, being careful of the bookings, but also in sharing expenses and reducing expenses from that perspective.
Okay, well, it certainly seems to be a move that makes sense. It seems to be right in the wheelhouse and the same kind of goals that you have at the pavilion and that, so I'm curious to see how it works out. Thank you.
Any other questions? Councilor Neitzer.
Just a statement. I would say that as somebody who's generally fiscally conservative, it was a journey for me to get here, but kind of to your point, I want these facilities to be sustainable and not bleed, but I'm also okay with the fact that if they get to profitability, that's great. But I think it's very important to talk to people about there's a quality of life aspect here. And so with certain venues, you know, it's okay, you know, if they don't ever make money. If they do, that's great. Then we have to be able to continue to run them. But if we have to make some investment in them because they're important to the community, we should be able to say that out loud, that quality of life is worth some amount of money. So.
Any other questions? I have a couple. Appreciate your presentation, and Darren, you as well. I know this has been talked about for several years, and it just was bad timing. The timing just did not work, and so I'm grateful that you guys have figured it out and brought this forward. I just, again, think it makes sense. My question is in regards to some of the users. There's primary group users, and it's my understanding, I know there was an article, I don't know, within the last year that talked about a substantial balance outstanding by some of these user groups. My question is, does that transfer over, and does the Washington Pavilion inherit that? Is that being paid down, or is the city saying, thanks for playing, and we're just gonna wipe it off the books for now? I don't know how that works, and so that's where my question lies. And then how does that work for, my next question to you, Darren, would be is, how would that look like for these users to continue to use the facility and not get so far behind again?
Good questions. So we did have one user group that has a significant receivable that has been booked to that, and that has that increased substantially in early 2018 and has been slowly working its way down to the present amount. We do not, because of the way those management agreements are structured, I'll give you an example. We somewhat own the accounts receivable at the event center because they're part of that net equity position for us. But we don't, for the Washington Pavilion, the receivables really aren't the city's because they're managing and operating the facility, and we don't own their accounts. So it's not really an asset of the city, those receivables. So because there is this outstanding receivable, and it's kind of in the city's position, in order to move it over to the Washington Pavilion, we would probably have to write a check to the Washington Pavilion so that they could buy the receivable from SMG and from the city, and it's just kind of a circular rotation. Doesn't make any sense to operate in that manner. So what we've decided to do is continue to retain the receivable for the city with SMG. And SMG has continued those conversations with the organization in question and working their way down. And there's been some progress here over the last 9 months in reducing that receivable. But it's very important to us that that receivable will not go away. We will continue to work with that particular entity in coordination with Washington Pavilion to help continue working down that particular receivable.
Makes sense. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And then I'd be curious, as we move forward, is what happens with the board? Does it make sense to have a separate board? I know that you've got a pretty great oiled machine running at the pavilion. Is that something that we empower them to do and have that oversight, or how does that look? I'm not certain, but I'd be interested to see what you guys decide and what works best and makes the most sense for the Washington Pavilion, because we want that to be the most successful as possible. I don't have any other questions. Thank you very much. Anything else from any other counselors? Counselor Starr.
Yes, absolutely. If I could follow up on your question just a little bit. So if a group has a large outstanding receivable to the city, are we at the point where we're cutting them off to the facility till they've?
What has
You know,
occurred
what's
with
the
this
normal
particular
policy?
tenant is that they have been put into a position where they have to prepay for their utilization going forward to ensure that that receivable did not continue to accrue. I believe, I'm not going to speak for Darren, I would assume that they would take the same vantage point in regard to that going forward to ensure that that liability does not continue. My concerns with the receivables getting to this amount is that it amounts to an unauthorized appropriation from the City Council. We have several nonprofit organizations that stand before you each year and petition you for funds because we understand that there is a need, whether based on quality of life or community need, that they receive funding. And by allowing a receivable to get to a large amount like that, it's as if we're subsidizing that group without actually going through the process that everybody else has to go through. And perhaps that is necessary to maintain that group, but it should be gone through the same process and channels that everyone else would go through.
What's the amount?
The last I checked on the financials was approximately just shy of $82,000.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that. Anything else? All right, we will move on to the next item. The last item we have today is the National Citizen Survey. Welcome David Bixler, the Council Budget Analyst.
Good afternoon, David Bixler, Budget Analyst. I'm going to go through the National Citizen Survey. The survey takes place every 2 years, and this year 3,000 surveys were mailed and 674 were returned. The National Citizen Survey focuses on 3 pillars of community: community characteristics, what makes a community livable and attractive; governance, how well is the city government meeting citizens' needs; and participation, how well are the residents of the city connected. The survey asks respondents to rate features within the 8 facets across the 3 pillars of community. Community characteristics. 91% of respondents rated Sioux Falls as an excellent or good place to live. Economy rated very strong. Sioux Falls ratings came in higher than the national benchmarks. Fitness opportunities, opportunities to volunteer, and recreation and wellness also rated higher than national benchmarks. Within the community characteristics pillar, there were no facets or features that were below national benchmarks. The next slides are examples of questions asked to measure the residents' perceptions of community characteristics. First question is, recommend living in Sioux Falls to someone who asked. The graph illustrates the somewhat likely and very likely responses remain strong from 2013 to the present. The second question, rate the overall quality of life in Sioux Falls. Again, the trend over time stays steady. Also, we see more respondents are moving from the good rating to the excellent rating. The next pillar is governance. How well does the government meet the needs and expectations of the residents? 80% of residents rate the quality of services the city provides as good or excellent. Citizens' ratings of overall government confidence increased from 2017 to 2019. The governance pillar had fewer facets or features above national benchmarks, but again, there were none that were below national benchmarks. The following graph illustrates residents' perception of the governance pillar. Rate the quality of services provided by Sioux Falls. Again, the trend over time reflects positive ratings. The job Sioux Falls government does at welcoming citizen involvement. This trend for this question is positive, with a 6% point increase in the good category from 2017 to 2019. The final pillar is participation. Are the residents connected to the community and each other? Within this pillar, while there were 4 features that exceeded the national benchmark, there were 3 features where Sioux Falls is below the national benchmark, and they were used public transportation instead of driving, walked or biked instead of driving, or attended a local public meeting. The dashboard summary condenses the features within the facets of the three pillars. Each of the facets has a detailed dashboard. Within the economy facet, features are listed under the corresponding pillar. At the top of the table are the three pillars: community characteristics, governance, and participation. Each feature notes the trend from the 2017 survey results and how it compares to national benchmarks. The second detailed dashboard is for mobility. In both the community characteristics and participation pillars, the dependability of our vehicles and other use of the transit system is reflected. Within the governance pillar, trends reflect positive ratings in street repair, snow removal, sidewalk maintenance, and traffic signal timing for the 2017 survey results. Additional information is provided with the survey. First is comparisons of demographic subgroups, and this reflects opinions of citizens due to the length of time they lived in Sioux Falls, their income level, their age, and their housing unit type. There's also comparisons of geographic subgroups that reflect respondents' opinions from the 5 districts of the city. And the trends over time, this report compares results from the 2019 survey to prior surveys. Respondents were asked to record their opinions about improvements to Sioux Falls in the following question: what can city government do to improve Sioux Falls? Of the 674 surveys returned, 291 respondents wrote in responses. The table represents the volume of responses to the categories. Over a third of the responses were regarding roads, public parking, transportation, traffic, and snow removal. The National Citizen Survey is on the city's website, on the City Council webpage. And with that, I'll answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bixler. Any questions? Kurt, Councilor Sale, I'm sorry.
I just have a couple of quick statements. Mr. Bixler, I appreciate the speed of what you delivered your report. It's excellent. And I would like to point out on page 6 of the total report, the department that received the highest rating was, of course, the department that brought me along, which is the fire department. So a shout out to the fire people right there.
Councilor Neitzer.
Just more of a observation as I read the report. No surprise, some of the things that we have the most to work on is public transit and accessible housing, which obviously we're focusing on. It was very interesting that there seemed to be a lot of interest in public parking. And, and I'm not exactly sure if I ask somebody what public parking, what does that mean to you? Because there seemed to be some indication that people thought it could be better or improved. And I'm not sure, I don't think we dig down into, what does that mean? That parking downtown, the cost of parking downtown, somewhere else in the city. And then as I kind of read it over and I look at some of the responses, something I'm big on trying to work forward on is walkability, but it's clear to me that before we can talk about the what, we have to talk about the why and need to sell people on why they should care about walkability, because the focus obviously is very much, car centric and getting to places as fast as possible. So I think I got to make, and others would have to make the sale first of why before we can talk about what. So just observations. Interesting report. So thanks.
Anybody else? Councilor Selberg.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, overall a great report. I guess my question maybe would be, again, most of the things fell in over the national average. Could you sum up? I can read a little closer to and find out myself, but what fell below national average? Anything I don't think anything's alarming either, but anything stick out for you?
Mostly transportation and the underutilization of the transit system. That's really where most of the lower than the national benchmarks fell in that category.
Okay. Well, nice job on this. I think this is the first year you kind of took over rounding all this up and putting it together, so good work. Thank you.
Councilor Brecky.
Since you went through all the work to digest it, just any things that just kind of stuck out in your mind that, didn't necessarily, but just that were of interest, little points of interest that stuck out to you as you went through it that you'd just like to share?
Yes, from 2013 till 2019, each year our response rates has declined. In 2013, it was a little over 30%. This year, it's just a little over 22%. So I might have to look at finding ways to lift that up more to the community when we go to do our next survey.
Thank you.
Any, Councilor?
Quick follow-up to that. What's the average for, you've told me this before though, but the average response to things like this is what percentage?
20 to 40% are over the nation is what the expectations are from the National Research Center.
And what were we last year and what are we this year?
This year we were a little over 22. Right. Last year we were a little over 24, I believe. Then it was 27, and in 2013 it was just a little over 30%. So it's continually declined.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Just to piggyback on that a little bit too, is, something that this has changed, just for maybe those that are newer, that this has changed departments as far as being on, who's paid for it, and essentially then the council has took ownership of this particular survey that we do every 2 years, and we do it in collaboration with the departments, asking them for their feedback to look over it as well. But maybe it's time, as we look at technology changing and how we can communicate with people, maybe there's a better way to do it. I don't know yet, but I certainly reached out to Jason and said, what do you think? How can we do this better, and making sure that we have the best responses and the best feedback from the community for these questions. There certainly is validity in having them asked over and over again, so we can gauge them over the years. I think that's really important for us as we reflect on that. But for the most part, how can we really engage the citizens better with this, but not skew it to where people are filling it out 3 and 4 times? So just a thought to consider. Councilor Nather.
Is it paper only?
Yes.
See, I'll just tell you from my perspective, I get a paper survey. And now, if you have a link on it that says I can go online and I can punch in a key into it, I might do it. Now, that might be generational, but for me, you're going to have to put in a $5 bill to get me to do a paper one and put it in the mail. But that's just me. So.
One thing I will say also that you had touched on, Councilor Erickson, was that from 2013 to date, we've consistently used the same questions, so we can really measure the ratings over time. And you can see it by the districts, the different capital projects that take place. You can see the impact it has on the surveys. So there is some, if you dig into the details, there's some good information in there.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for all your work on this. I know it was a new project for you this year, so we appreciate that as a whole. Is there a motion? Not to. Oh, I'm sorry. Is there any public comment? Okay, seeing none. Is there a motion? Councilor Neitzer.
I move to enter executive session for the purpose of consulting with legal counsel or reviewing communications from legal counsel about proposed or pending litigation or contractual matters pursuant to SDCL 1-25-2, subpart 3.
Seriously.
Second.
There's been a motion to enter executive session and a second. All those in favor say aye. 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 Opposed, no. Okay. We will enter executive session. We'll start in about 2 minutes because it's time sensitive.